August 1945. The city of Yokohama lay in ruins, its skyline reduced to a jagged silhouette of chimneys and half-broken walls. The smell of ash clung to the humid summer air, a reminder of firebombings that had turned once bustling neighborhoods into seas of rubble. On a narrow street near the port, a strange transaction unfolded in the shadows of defeat. A gaunt Japanese shopkeeper slid 2 rice balls across a counter, his hands trembling with exhaustion. In return, an American soldier, helmet tilted back, placed a single pack of Lucky Strikes on the wood. No yen exchanged hands, no coins clinked. Just cigarettes, American cigarettes, passing into civilian hands as though they were bars of gold. The scene was repeated thousands of times across occupied Japan. In markets where the yen had lost its meaning, paper money printed by the emperor himself lay ignored, folded and crumpled like worthless scraps. Instead, thin white sticks of tobacco wrapped in delicate paper became the currency of survival. To a mother desperate to feed her child, 1 cigarette might mean a bowl of miso soup. To a black market broker, on the streets of Tokyo, a carton of Camels was the key to riches. Greater than any salary once earned in factories or banks, it seemed absurd, almost surreal, that the economic power of an ancient empire could be replaced by a commodity so fragile it turned to ash in minutes. Yet this was the new reality. The might of America had not only defeated Japan on the battlefield, but had shattered the very foundation of its economy. Bombs had destroyed industries, but it was the collapse of confidence in the yen that forced civilians into the strange calculus of survival. A nation that once marched to the rising sun was now held hostage by something as small and disposable as a cigarette. At first, Japanese civilians were stunned. Many could not comprehend how these foreign soldiers, fresh from victory, carried with them objects more valuable than money itself. "Kain wa nai shikashi tabako wa aru," whispered one old man near Ueno Station. "There is no money, but there are cigarettes." For the occupying GIs, cartons flowed like water. The US military shipped them overseas by the millions, a morale booster for troops who smoked between patrols, before meals, and in moments of boredom. But for the Japanese, those same cigarettes became lifelines. On the rubble-strewn streets, the power balance was on full display. Soldiers flicked away half-smoked butts, and desperate civilians darted forward, scooping them up before they touched the dirt. A child might run home, clutching that tiny fragment of tobacco as though it were a diamond. In alleys, women offered services in exchange for a pack. Men gambled in smoky rooms, not with yen or coins, but with Lucky Strikes and Chesterfields. The cigarette had become both sustenance and symbol. Sustenance because it could be traded for rice, bread, or fish. Symbol because it revealed the helplessness of a once mighty nation brought to its knees. The sound of rustling paper currency no longer carried meaning in Japan's shattered economy. Inflation had gutted the yen until it was practically worthless. A pack of American cigarettes, meanwhile, had a fixed and undeniable value. In Nagoya, 1 cigarette could buy 2 eggs. In Osaka, 3 cigarettes bought a ride across town. In Tokyo's Ginza district, entire backrooms of burned-out shops were converted into black market bazaars, with prices chalked on wooden boards not in yen, but in cigarette equivalents. An apple, 4 sticks. A bottle of sake, 10. A night's company with a woman, an entire pack. Japanese civilians looked on with awe and humiliation. For centuries, the economy had been grounded in rice, gold, or paper notes, backed by imperial authority. Now a consumable vice, something that vanished into smoke, outweighed every official decree. The cigarettes smelled of foreign power, their logos printed in English, their paper smooth to the touch. Some civilians saved empty packs not to smoke, but as trophies, reminders that this fragile commodity had once meant more than Emperor Hirohito's own currency. Even the black market had its kings and emperors. Men with connections to American supply lines became rich overnight. A single truck diverted from the docks could flood the streets with cartons worth more than the salaries of hundreds of clerks. To the eyes of Japanese citizens, it felt as though the American soldier carried not just a rifle and rations, but the power to dictate the rhythm of civilian life. And yet, behind every exchange lingered the sting of shame. Proud fathers, once factory managers or officers in uniform, now stood in line to barter away family heirlooms for a few sticks. Mothers swallowed pride, offering what little dignity they had left in exchange for a pack that could feed their children for a week. A nation built on honor now bowed before cigarettes. To the American GIs it was almost comical. They joked about how their smokes turned them into kings on foreign soil. They knew cigarettes were plentiful, issued by the crate, shipped endlessly from factories in North Carolina and New Jersey. But they also understood, even if only half seriously, that they wielded an invisible power. A GI with 2 cartons could control a street corner in Tokyo better than a policeman with a baton. In the shadows, Japanese officials and economists watched with alarm. They understood the symbolism. Money meant nothing without trust. The yen had not simply lost value, it had lost faith. And in its place, cigarettes, alien and impermanent, had become tokens of trust among the defeated. One couldn't eat them, couldn't build with them, couldn't save them for long. But in that broken summer of 1945, cigarettes were survival, cigarettes were hope. Cigarettes were the empire of the moment. The ruins of war had created a strange new empire, an empire of smoke. And in that empire, it was not the generals or admirals who ruled, but the men with packs in their pockets, men who could light a match and change the fate of a starving family. This was the paradox of Japan's defeat. A nation that once measured its might in battleships and aircraft carriers now measured its survival in cigarettes. The story of cigarettes replacing yen was more than a quirk of post-war life. It was a symbol of how war does not just crush armies, it crushes economies, societies, and the very meanings people attach to value. To understand those days in 1945, one need only look at the desperation in the eyes of civilians and the casual flick of ash from the fingertips of American soldiers. In those moments, the battlefield was gone, but the war was still being fought, in hunger, in pride, and in the smoke curling upward from a burning cigarette. By the summer of 1945, Japan was a nation that had been bled dry. Its cities lay in ruins, its industries paralyzed, its people brought to the brink of starvation. Firebombing raids had incinerated more than 60 cities, reducing Tokyo, Osaka, Nagoya, and countless others to smoldering ruins. Rail lines were twisted steel, power grids shattered, and farmland left untended as young men died at the front. The yen, once backed by the authority of an empire stretching across Asia, now drifted like meaningless paper in a storm of inflation. In the wreckage of surrender, Japan's currency held little more weight than the ashes that covered its streets. The occupation began with shock. On September 2, 1945, aboard the deck of the USS Missouri in Tokyo Bay, Japan formally surrendered to the Allied powers. For millions of Japanese civilians, the announcement was a blow as profound as any bombing raid. The Emperor's voice, broadcast over radio, admitted defeat for the first time in history. What followed was silence, an eerie collective silence across the islands. But in the weeks after, that silence gave way to hunger, chaos, and the realization that survival would depend not on loyalty to the yen, but on what could be bartered in the streets. The Americans arrived as victors, but also as occupiers tasked with rebuilding a broken nation. General Douglas MacArthur established the Supreme Command for the Allied Powers, or SCAP, to oversee Japan's political, economic, and social reconstruction. His mission was vast: demilitarize Japan, democratize its institutions, and stabilize its economy. Yet the currency he had inherited, the yen, was a hollow shell. Hyperinflation tore through the civilian economy. Prices for rice, vegetables, and basic necessities skyrocketed daily, making wages meaningless. Workers could be paid in stacks of yen, only to find by week's end that those bills could not buy even a bowl of noodles. The black market, or yami-ichi, became the true lifeline of Japan. In alleys behind the Ginza district, on the edges of burned-out train stations, and even in quiet villages untouched by firebombs, stalls appeared overnight. Men and women spread blankets and laid out whatever they had, bits of jewelry, old clothes, family heirlooms. But above all, the most prized items were American cigarettes. The Lucky Strike, the Camel, the Chesterfield, brands that had meant little to Japanese civilians before the war, now dictated the rhythm of exchange. A man with a carton could trade for enough food to last a week. A woman with 2 packs could secure medicine for her sick child. The roots of this shift lay in supply and demand. During the war, tobacco had been rationed tightly in Japan. reserved largely for soldiers and government workers. Civilians often rolled their own from scraps of poor-quality domestic leaves. By contrast, American cigarettes arrived by the shipload. Their quality unmatched, their supply seemingly endless. U.S. Army quartermasters distributed them to GIs as part of daily rations, ensuring that every soldier had packs to spare. For American troops, cigarettes were comfort. For Japanese civilians, they were salvation. To understand the scale of collapse, one must consider the value of money itself. Currency is built on trust. Trust that the paper in hand will be accepted tomorrow as it is today. But by 1945, Japanese civilians had lost that trust in the yen. Inflation had eroded it. The surrender had humiliated it. Every day its purchasing power shrank further, until people preferred almost anything tangible, rice, sake, fish, soap, or smokes, over official currency. Cigarettes had what the yen lacked: stability. A single stick bought roughly the same in Yokohama as it did in Nagoya, the same in Tokyo as in Hiroshima. For a desperate people, this reliability was priceless. Cigarettes also carried psychological weight. They came in bright packaging, smooth and clean, printed in English letters that seemed to glow with foreign power. To hold one was to hold a piece of the conqueror's world, a reminder of America's abundance. Even the smell, rich, foreign, intoxicating, was a signal of something unattainable by domestic means. Many civilians smoked not for pleasure, but as a gesture of modernity, a taste of the empire that now dictated their future. The social order reshaped itself around this new economy. Black market brokers, once petty criminals, rose to prominence as they secured access to GI supplies. They smuggled cigarettes from docks, bribed soldiers, or bought from troops willing to sell their rations for extra cash. Soon entire networks spread through the cities, trading cartons for gold, silk, or even human labor. For some, the black market became the only way to survive. For others, it was a path to sudden wealth, though always shadowed by the fear of arrest. The occupying authorities, aware of the crisis, struggled to respond. American administrators feared that uncontrolled inflation and black market dominance could destabilize Japan's recovery. Attempts were made to stabilize the yen by pegging its value and introducing ration systems, but the measures faltered against the overwhelming pull of the cigarette economy. Even U.S. military police, tasked with suppressing black markets, were often compromised. Some sold their own rations to civilians, pocketing both cigarettes and yen. Japanese society adapted swiftly to the new hierarchy of value. Housewives bartered their husbands' old uniforms for packs. Children were sent into alleys to collect cigarette butts, which could be unrolled and rewoven into makeshift smokes. Farmers in rural areas, where crops were scarce and distribution broken, demanded cigarettes in exchange for rice or vegetables, refusing yen altogether. In cities, whispered negotiations took place under the flicker of oil lamps. How many sticks for a bowl of soup? How many packs for a night's shelter? Cigarettes did not just feed bellies, they reshaped relationships. Soldiers with access to cartons found themselves courted by desperate civilians. Young women, some barely more than teenagers, sold companionship or intimacy for a pack. Men gambled in smoke-filled dens, their fortunes rising and falling not in coins but in glowing embers. For the proud Japanese who had once believed in the strength of their empire and the honor of their currency, it was a humiliation layered upon defeat. But for many, pride was a luxury that hunger could not afford. In these early months of occupation, the cigarette became more than a commodity. It was a language of survival, a code by which civilians and soldiers negotiated a fragile coexistence. The yen still existed, but it no longer commanded obedience. Instead, the crumpled bills were shoved into drawers, while cigarettes lit the way forward. Small, fragile but undeniably powerful. This was the stage upon which post-war Japan's story unfolded, a nation stripped of its economy, surviving through barter, black markets, and the burning paper of American cigarettes. The battlefield had shifted from skies and seas to alleys and markets, where the true fight was no longer for territory, but for survival itself. The mystery of how a cigarette came to eclipse the yen lay not just in the collapse of Japan's economy, but in the hidden advantage America carried into the ruins of occupation. It was not written into surrender documents, nor declared by General MacArthur. It arrived quietly, in crates unloaded from Liberty ships. in cartons stacked inside duffel bags, in rations tucked into every GI's kit. The secret was abundance, an abundance Japan had never imagined possible. For the American soldier, cigarettes were as common as canteens or rifles. Since 1918, when the US military first recognized tobacco as essential to troop morale, cigarettes had been standard issue. By World War II, the system was perfected. Every K ration and C ration came with its small box of matches and a few cigarettes. Lucky Strikes, Chesterfields, Camels, Old Golds. Factories back home had churned them out by the billions, subsidized by the government, ensuring that no soldier went without. To the weary GI, a smoke was a pause, a comfort, a ritual in the midst of chaos. To the Japanese civilian, the sight of one was revelation. The advantage was not simply that Americans had cigarettes, but that they had so many. In 1944 alone, US tobacco companies produced 300 billion cigarettes, nearly half of which were reserved for the armed forces overseas. This meant that when the occupation began, American soldiers carried with them a mobile economy, small, portable, desirable items with fixed value. Unlike yen, which inflated and eroded daily, cigarettes held steady. Unlike rice, which spoiled, or fish, which rotted, cigarettes could be stored for months. They were durable, divisible, and easy to conceal, qualities that made them perfect as an alternative currency. To Japanese civilians who had endured rationing and scarcity for years, the sudden flood of these luxuries was shocking. Before the war, smoking in Japan was common but modest. Domestic brands like Peace or Asahi offered thin, uneven smokes, often rolled with coarse tobacco. During the war, even these were rationed to soldiers and elites, leaving civilians with little more than scraps of dried leaves. Some resorted to rolling weeds into paper, just to mimic the sensation of smoking. Against this backdrop, the American cigarette was exotic, smooth, flavorful, intoxicating. It was not merely a cigarette. It was America itself wrapped in paper. German soldiers had once felt a similar sting. On the European front, Wehrmacht troops grumbled when they discovered that American GIs received cigarettes by the crate, while they had to rely on ration cards and home front deliveries. Letters home often carried requests: send tobacco, send anything to smoke. By contrast, US soldiers lit up casually, offering cigarettes not just to one another, but to liberated civilians in France, Belgium, and Italy. The pattern repeated in Japan, but magnified by the total collapse of Japan's currency. Where German marks still held some sway in occupied Europe, the yen was dead. The cigarette stepped in to fill the void with ruthless efficiency. What Japanese civilians could not see at first was the larger machine behind this flood. Tobacco was more than morale. It was policy. The US military had partnered with companies like Philip Morris and R.J. Reynolds to keep soldiers stocked, but there was another motive: markets. Cigarettes carried American culture across the world. Every time a GI lit a Camel on a Tokyo street corner, he was not just satisfying a craving, he was advertising. And every Japanese civilian who traded food for a Lucky Strike was making an unspoken admission: America had something Japan needed. The cigarette was propaganda in smoke form, soft power wrapped in a filterless stick. This hidden advantage extended beyond sheer numbers. Cigarettes had universal appeal across class and age. Men smoked them, women coveted them, children begged for them. Unlike gold or jewelry, which only the wealthy could trade, cigarettes were democratic. They could be divided one by one, matched to the hunger of a day. A poor family might scrape together a few butts and re-roll them, while a rich merchant might barter in full cartons. The value scaled with need, and need was everywhere. The Japanese police and officials were not blind to this transformation. Reports filtered into SCAP headquarters, describing entire neighborhoods where cigarettes replaced yen entirely. Soldiers selling their rations to civilians created shadow economies, and even Japanese currency officers admitted privately that cigarettes had become the real money of the streets. For the Americans, it was both problem and opportunity. On one hand, it undermined efforts to stabilize the yen. On the other, it provided a tool to keep the civilian population docile, distracted, and dependent. A hungry man with yen might riot. A hungry man with a cigarette had something to trade. What startled Japanese civilians most was the casual nature with which Americans handled their new currency. Soldiers tossed away half-smoked sticks, flicking them into gutters, where children scrambled like miners searching for gold. Civilians who once bowed before the emperor now bowed before a soldier's lit cigarette, begging for a drag or a discarded butt. The imbalance was humiliating, but it also revealed the true scale of American abundance. To the Japanese, it was unthinkable. How could a nation possess such wealth that it treated treasure as trash? The power of the cigarette was not merely economic, but symbolic. It whispered a truth that official propaganda had denied for years. Japan had been beaten not only by bombs, but by industrial might so overwhelming it spilled luxuries across oceans. The cigarette was proof of victory, a daily reminder that America could produce endlessly while Japan starved. It was not just smoke. It was dominance, rolled and lit for all to see. In whispered conversations in black market stalls, civilians admitted what they dared not say aloud. The yen belongs to the emperor, but cigarettes belong to survival. They had identified the hidden advantage that defined the occupation. America did not just defeat Japan with firebombs and atomic blasts. It defeated Japan with cartons stacked higher than the ruins of Tokyo, with a commodity so simple and seductive that it rewrote the rules of value. And so, the cigarette, fragile, fleeting, destined to vanish in smoke, became the cornerstone of an invisible empire. An empire not declared in treaties or carved on maps, but lived daily in alleys and markets, in the exchange of paper-wrapped sticks for bowls of rice. The Japanese could not believe it at first, but soon disbelief gave way to recognition. This was the hidden advantage. This was how America ruled the ruins. A cigarette looked simple, paper, tobacco, a logo stamped on its box. But in post-war Japan, its power came not only from scarcity, but from the immense industrial machine that lay behind every pack. To grasp why it became more valuable than yen, one must step inside the factories of America, where tobacco was not merely rolled, but engineered into consistency, reliability, and mass production at a scale Japan could never match. Each U.S. Army C ration included 4 cigarettes. Every K ration contained them as standard issue, nestled alongside biscuits, chocolate, and powdered coffee. They were not luxuries. They were military equipment, classified as essential as ammunition. By 1944, the Quartermaster Corps had arranged contracts with companies like Philip Morris, R.J. Reynolds, American Tobacco Company, and Liggett & Myers. These corporations ran around the clock, churning out billions of cigarettes wrapped in military-issue packaging. Soldiers carried them in their breast pockets, trading them as naturally as they handled bullets. Technically, an American cigarette in 1945 was a marvel of industrial consistency. A single Lucky Strike stick measured about 70 millimeters in length, wrapped in thin, high-grade paper, filled with a blend of Virginia, Burley, and Oriental tobaccos. Each carton contained 10 packs, each pack 20 cigarettes, 200 sticks in total. A standard GI ration included at least 1 pack per day, meaning millions of cigarettes were shipped across the Pacific every week. Stored in wax-coated cartons to resist humidity, they arrived fresh, ready to burn with smooth flavor. Compared to Japan's brittle wartime products, thin rolls made from poor-quality leaf, American cigarettes felt almost luxurious. The production numbers alone tell the story. In 1945, U.S. companies produced more than 300 billion cigarettes. Of these, billions were diverted directly to the military. Factories in North Carolina, Virginia, and New Jersey operated with military precision, supplying endless shipments that followed American troops wherever they went. Crates filled the holds of Liberty ships, stacked alongside ammunition and canned meat. When GIs marched through Europe, Africa, or Asia, cigarettes marched with them. For every soldier with a rifle, there were dozens of cigarettes waiting to be smoked or traded. Packaging mattered too. The bold green and white of Lucky Strike, the camel on camel packs, the sleek Chesterfield lettering all carried an allure of modernity. For Japanese civilians used to plain, coarse wrappers, these American brands gleamed with an exotic polish. Each pack was a miniature billboard of abundance, its design as carefully engineered as its taste. The cigarette became not just a product, but a symbol of industrial artistry. In the black markets of Tokyo and Osaka, unopened packs became talismans of foreign wealth, coveted not only for the smoke inside, but for the prestige of the packaging. The durability of cigarettes made them an ideal substitute currency. Unlike yen bills, which lost purchasing power daily, a pack of Camels held its value. Unlike rice, which spoiled, cigarettes could sit in storage for months without decay. Unlike gold, which was too valuable for daily trade, cigarettes were divisible, their value calibrated stick by stick. One could pay with a single cigarette or with an entire pack. This flexibility made them adaptable to every level of transaction, from a child buying sweet potatoes to a black market broker arranging bulk shipments. Japanese cigarettes simply could not compete. Wartime shortages had forced domestic producers to stretch their limited supplies with fillers and poor-grade leaves. Civilians rolled crude imitations from weeds and straw, sometimes even dried tea leaves. The result was harsh, acrid smoke that irritated the throat. When American cigarettes arrived smooth and flavorful, they seemed like another species entirely. A single drag was enough to convince civilians of their superiority. In comparison, the yen had nothing to offer but diminishing paper promises. The scale of distribution was staggering. Quartermaster records reveal that by the end of the war, U.S. forces overseas were consuming nearly 45 million cigarettes per day. Every GI became a walking dispenser, every duffel bag a bank vault. In Japan, where millions starved, this flow of tobacco represented an invisible economy larger than any ration system. Civilians quickly realized that cigarettes were the only reliable medium of exchange. With them, one could buy rice, fish, medicine, even companionship. Without them, yen bills stacked high but meant nothing. Factories in America understood this dynamic. Tobacco executives, shrewd and forward-looking, recognized the occupation as a marketing opportunity. They ensured that soldiers carried branded cigarettes overseas, knowing that exposure in occupied countries would create new consumers. In Japan, this strategy succeeded beyond expectation. By 1947, when domestic production began to recover, Japanese smokers had developed a taste for American brands, elevating them above local competitors. The cigarette's role as currency had doubled as cultural conquest. Even its physical design contributed to its function as money. A cigarette could be divided, rationed, or shared. A soldier might give half a pack to a hungry family, and that pack would feed them for days, as they traded each stick for food. The small size allowed concealment, enabling smugglers to carry thousands without notice. Unlike coins which jingled or bills which tore, cigarettes were discreet and silent. In a city policed by occupation forces, this subtlety mattered. The technical precision of production also lent cigarettes credibility. A Chesterfield smoked in Yokohama tasted identical to one smoked in Chicago. This consistency built trust. Civilians knew that a cigarette would not betray them. It would burn true every time. The yen, by contrast, betrayed them daily, losing value before their eyes. Trust shifted from currency backed by government decree to currency backed by the reliability of industrial machines thousands of miles away. Even the smell played a role. Tobacco's aroma drifted through ruined streets, signaling transactions before words were spoken. A lit cigarette was a beacon, drawing the desperate. For some, the scent itself became addictive, not to smoke but to imagine what might be gained by possession. In this way, cigarettes were not merely objects of trade, but sensory markers of survival. Thus, what looked like a fragile stick of paper and leaf was in fact a masterpiece of wartime logistics, corporate strategy, and industrial muscle. It was currency engineered by accident, born of abundance, refined through mass production, and distributed by soldiers who scarcely understood the empire of smoke they carried in their pockets. For Japan, the contrast was crushing. Its economy lay in tatters, its yen hollow, its industries in ruins. America's cigarette was the embodiment of everything Japan had lost: stability, abundance, and trust. And as the occupation deepened, this technical marvel of industrial consistency did more than replace the yen. It rewrote the rules of value in a nation struggling to survive. The summer of 1942 marked a subtle but decisive shift in the tide of war. For over 3 years, Adolf Hitler's armies had carved their way across Europe, leaving behind smoldering cities, displaced millions, and broken nations. Yet now the invincible facade of the Reich began to crack, not in one decisive blow, but in a series of grinding battles, relentless campaigns, and unexpected acts of defiance. On the vast steppes of the Soviet Union, the Battle of Stalingrad unfolded with a ferocity that stunned even seasoned generals. The city, once a proud symbol of Soviet industry on the Volga River, became the focal point of Hitler's ambitions. To the Führer, conquering Stalingrad meant breaking Soviet morale and seizing control of a critical industrial artery. But for Joseph Stalin, the defense of the city carried symbolic weight. It bore his very name, and losing it was unthinkable. Stalingrad descended into hell. German panzers and artillery reduced entire districts to rubble, yet the Soviets clung to every street, every factory, every basement. Snipers hunted German officers from shattered windows. Soviet soldiers crossed the Volga under withering fire, ferried into the inferno to reinforce dwindling defenders. The Luftwaffe dropped thousands of bombs, but the ruins became a fortress for Soviet resistance. As the brutal winter set in, the tide shifted. The Red Army launched Operation Uranus, a massive counteroffensive encircling the German Sixth Army. Hitler's generals pleaded for a retreat, but the Führer commanded them to stand fast, declaring, "Surrender is forbidden." Cut off, starving and freezing, over 250,000 German troops faced annihilation. By February 1943, the once proud Sixth Army lay crushed, an entire field force wiped out in one of history's most decisive battles. The myth of Nazi invincibility was shattered, but the turning tide was not confined to the east. In North Africa, British General Bernard Montgomery clashed with Erwin Rommel, the legendary Desert Fox. At El Alamein in late 1942, Montgomery's forces broke through Axis lines, pushing Rommel's army into retreat. Winston Churchill would later declare, "Before Alamein we never had a victory. After Alamein we never had a defeat." Meanwhile, across the Atlantic, the United States had begun to flex its industrial and military might. The attack on Pearl Harbor had awakened a sleeping giant, and by mid-1942, American forces engaged the Japanese at the Battle of Midway. In a stunning reversal, U.S. carriers ambushed and sank 4 Japanese aircraft carriers, crippling the Imperial Navy's offensive capability. What had begun as a desperate defensive war for the Allies was now shifting toward a campaign of counteroffensives. In the shadows, resistance movements grew bolder. In occupied France, railways were sabotaged, German patrols ambushed, and intelligence funneled to London. In Yugoslavia, partisans waged a relentless guerrilla war, tying down Axis divisions in brutal mountain campaigns. These movements, though fragmented and perilous, proved that Hitler's grip on Europe was not absolute, and in the United States and Britain, skies filled with the distant hum of bombers. The Allied strategic bombing campaign struck at German industry, cities and infrastructure. Though costly and controversial, these raids signaled a new dimension of war, where entire populations found themselves on the front lines. Hamburg, Cologne, Berlin all bore the scars of Allied firestorms. For the Axis, the war was becoming a test of endurance it could not win. Germany faced not only the unyielding determination of the Soviets, but also the industrial power of America and the steadfast resolve of the British Empire. Italy, once a proud Axis partner, faltered under the weight of repeated defeats. By 1943, Mussolini's regime was on the verge of collapse, a harbinger of the unraveling alliance. Yet, even as the tide turned, the cost was staggering. Millions more would perish in battles yet to come. Entire cities would vanish in fire and steel. The Holocaust, the darkest chapter of humanity, intensified. With Nazi leaders accelerating their final solution, trains carried millions of Jews, Romani and others deemed undesirable to extermination camps, even as German soldiers froze and starved at Stalingrad. By the end of 1943, the world could sense that Hitler's grand empire was no longer destined for triumph. But victory was still far away, and the road ahead promised unimaginable bloodshed. The war had shifted, yes, but the true storm was yet to break. By 1943, the tide of war had begun to shift. The world watched as Adolf Hitler's forces, once seemingly unstoppable, faced blow after blow. Stalingrad had fallen, North Africa was slipping from Axis hands, and the Japanese Navy reeled from its crushing defeat at Midway. Yet this was not the end of the war, but the beginning of an even more brutal phase. For the Allies, the time for survival was over. The time to strike back had arrived. The first major test of this new momentum came in North Africa. After El Alamein, the British Eighth Army pressed Rommel's Afrika Korps westward, while American forces, newly blooded at Kasserine Pass, regrouped and strengthened under General Dwight D. Eisenhower. In May 1943, the Allies launched Operation Torch, a coordinated assault from east and west. Surrounded and outmatched, Axis forces surrendered in Tunisia. Nearly 250,000 German and Italian troops were taken prisoner, a disaster Hitler could ill afford. With North Africa secured, the Allies turned their gaze toward Europe's soft underbelly, Italy. In July 1943, Allied forces stormed ashore in Sicily. The island became a bloody proving ground, where German rearguards fought with cunning ferocity. But the invasion triggered political earthquakes. Mussolini's fascist regime collapsed. Italy surrendered to the Allies, though German troops quickly occupied the country and turned it into yet another battlefield. The campaign for Italy was long and bitter. From Salerno to Anzio, and finally the grueling battle at Monte Cassino, Allied soldiers faced dug-in German defenders, treacherous mountains, and relentless artillery. Yet every mile gained brought them closer to Central Europe and closer to the heart of the Reich. Meanwhile, in the skies over Germany, a new kind of war raged. The Allied bombing campaign intensified, striking at factories, oil refineries, and rail networks. Cities like Hamburg and Dresden burned under waves of incendiary bombs. Their skies turned to firestorms. These missions carried staggering costs. Bomber crews faced near-suicidal odds against German fighters and flak. Yet the campaign forced the Reich to divert precious resources into defending its skies, weakening its armies on the ground. Across the Atlantic, American industry roared at full throttle. The arsenal of democracy churned out tanks, planes, and ships at a pace Hitler could never match. Women filled factories, men enlisted by the millions, and a sense of total war gripped the nation. Liberty ships carried supplies to Europe faster than German U-boats could sink them. For every ship lost, America built several more, but the oceans remained perilous. The Battle of the Atlantic became a silent war of sonar, depth charges, and wolf packs of U-boats. German submarines stalked Allied convoys, sinking countless tons of shipping. Yet by 1943, improved radar, long-range aircraft, and escort carriers tipped the balance. The hunters became the hunted, and U-boat losses soared. The Atlantic lifeline, vital to sustaining Britain and supplying Allied offensives, was secured. As Europe trembled under occupation, resistance movements struck back. In Poland, the Warsaw Ghetto uprising became a symbol of desperate defiance, where poorly armed Jewish fighters resisted German forces against impossible odds. In France, the Maquis sabotaged rail lines and ambushed patrols, preparing for the day of liberation. These movements were fragile, often betrayed, but they kept the flame of freedom alive in lands where darkness reigned. Far to the east, the Soviet Union pressed its advantage. In July 1943, the titanic Battle of Kursk erupted, the largest tank battle in history. Over 6,000 tanks and millions of men clashed on the vast Russian plains. The German offensive faltered against Soviet minefields, entrenched defenses, and relentless counterattacks. When the smoke cleared, Hitler's last great gamble in the east had failed. The Red Army surged westward, driving German forces back through Ukraine and toward Poland. The Wehrmacht, once master of the Blitzkrieg, now fought a desperate, grinding retreat. By late 1943, Allied leaders gathered at the Tehran Conference. Roosevelt, Churchill, and Stalin united in strategy. They agreed on one bold goal: the opening of a second front in Western Europe. The invasion of Nazi-occupied France would be the greatest amphibious operation in history. Preparations began in secrecy, while Hitler poured concrete and steel into his so-called Atlantic Wall, fortifying Europe's coastline against the storm he knew was coming. And across the Pacific, the war against Japan entered a new phase. The Americans embraced a strategy of island hopping, bypassing heavily fortified strongholds to seize strategic islands. At Guadalcanal, Tarawa, and the Gilbert Islands, U.S. Marines endured hellish fighting in jungles and on coral reefs, inching closer to Japan. Each victory tightened the noose, while Japanese soldiers, bound by a code of death before dishonor, fought with suicidal determination. For the Axis, 1943 marked the beginning of a long descent. Italy had fallen, the Eastern Front crumbled, the Atlantic was lost, and the skies over Germany burned. But Hitler remained defiant. He spoke of secret weapons, of turning the tide once again. Yet in truth the Reich was bleeding, hemorrhaging men, machines, and hope. The Allies were no longer on the defensive. They were on the march. And the world braced itself, for the greatest invasion in history was about to begin. June 6, 1944. Dawn broke grey and cold over the English Channel. A storm had churned the waters for days, but now, in the dim light of morning, the horizon was filled with shadows, shadows that grew into the largest armada the world had ever seen. More than 5,000 ships, thousands of landing craft, and an unending stream of aircraft thundered toward the coast of France. On their decks and in their holds waited an army of liberation, 156,000 men, soldiers of the United States, Britain, Canada, and their allies, bound for a single strip of coastline forever etched into history: Normandy. For months, Hitler had boasted of his Atlantic Wall. Bunkers, artillery batteries, minefields, and barbed wire stretched across the coastline from Norway to the Spanish border. The Germans believed it impenetrable. Field Marshal Erwin Rommel himself had overseen its construction, declaring that the moment of invasion must be stopped on the beaches, or not at all. Yet the storm that rose over the Channel carried with it not defeat, but destiny. As the first landing craft approached, the skies erupted. Allied bombers and naval guns roared, pounding German positions with an apocalyptic fury. The beaches shook, sand and earth spraying into the air as concrete bunkers shuddered under fire. But when the ramps dropped, the reality was merciless. At Omaha Beach, American soldiers stepped into a wall of machine gun fire. The sea turned red as men fell in the surf, cut down before they touched dry sand. Equipment sank, boats overturned, officers were killed within seconds of landing. The first waves were slaughtered, and for a time it seemed Omaha would break the invasion. Yet in chaos came courage. Small groups of men crawled forward, blowing gaps in the wire with satchel charges, scaling cliffs under withering fire, calling artillery strikes by radio through the thunder of battle. At Point du Hoc, U.S. Rangers climbed sheer rock faces under enemy fire, determined to silence the guns that could devastate the beaches. By sheer willpower, by sacrifice beyond measure, footholds were carved from hell itself. Elsewhere, on Utah, Gold, Juno, and Sword beaches, progress came quicker. The Canadians stormed ashore with grim determination, pushing inland through minefields and machine guns. British troops fought their way toward Caen, a city key to controlling the region. American paratroopers of the 82nd and 101st Airborne had already dropped deep behind enemy lines in the night, seizing bridges, cutting roads, and sowing confusion among German defenders. By nightfall, the beaches of Normandy were secure. It had cost more than 10,000 Allied casualties in a single day. But the impossible had been achieved. Europe's liberation had begun. Hitler had been deceived. His generals had believed the main invasion would come at Calais, the narrowest point of the Channel. A masterstroke of Allied deception. Dummy armies, fake radio chatter, even inflatable tanks had convinced the Germans to hold their strongest reserves far from Normandy. When the truth became clear, it was too late. The Allies had landed, and they were not leaving. The battle for Normandy, however, was far from over. For weeks, the countryside became a brutal maze of hedgerows and villages, where German defenders fought with fanatical resolve. Tanks bogged down in fields, artillery shattered towns, and every farm became a fortress. Casualties mounted, but slowly, relentlessly, the Allies pushed inland. At Saint-Lô and Carentan, at Caen and Falaise, the fighting was fierce and unyielding. Then in August, the breakout came. Operation Cobra unleashed American armored divisions into the open country. Once free of the hedgerows, their momentum was unstoppable. German lines crumbled under the weight of Allied firepower. At the Falaise pocket, tens of thousands of German troops were encircled, their retreat a massacre of burning tanks and shattered columns. What remained of Hitler's armies in France staggered eastward, broken and beaten. Paris rose before them next. For 4 long years, the French capital had endured the boot of Nazi occupation. Now in late August 1944, resistance fighters filled the streets, tearing down German banners, raising the tricolour once more. When Free French forces, led by General Leclerc, entered the city, the bells of Notre Dame rang out in triumph. Crowds wept, sang, and embraced their liberators. The City of Light was free again. As summer turned to autumn, the Allies pressed toward Germany. Belgium and Luxembourg were liberated, and Allied columns rolled across the Rhine's approaches. Yet the war was not yet won. In December, Hitler launched one final desperate counteroffensive, the Battle of the Bulge. In the frozen forests of the Ardennes, German tanks and soldiers surged forward, cutting through American lines. Snow fell, fog thickened, and chaos spread as Bastogne, a small Belgian town, became the linchpin of the struggle. Surrounded and outnumbered, the 101st Airborne Division dug in. When the Germans demanded surrender, Brigadier General Anthony McAuliffe's reply was legendary in its defiance: nuts. The Americans held, and reinforcements under General Patton's Third Army broke through. Hitler's gamble had failed, leaving the Wehrmacht shattered and exhausted. By spring of 1945, Allied armies were at the gates of Germany. From the west, the Americans, British, and Canadians crossed the Rhine. From the east, the Red Army closed in with relentless fury, sweeping through Poland and into the heart of the Reich. Town by town, bridge by bridge, the Allies advanced. In April, they discovered the true horror behind Nazi walls: concentration camps, filled with skeletal survivors, the evidence of crimes beyond imagination. Soldiers wept as they freed the living and confronted the dead. On April 30th, as Soviet troops stormed Berlin, Adolf Hitler took his own life in a bunker beneath the ruined city. 1 week later, Germany surrendered unconditionally. Across Europe, church bells rang, crowds filled the streets, and the guns finally fell silent. Victory in Europe had come at a cost of unimaginable scale: tens of millions dead, cities reduced to rubble, an entire continent scarred forever. The liberation of Europe was not the end of the war, but it marked the beginning of a new era. In the ashes of battle, nations would rebuild. Alliances would harden into the Cold War. Yet the lesson of D-Day, of Normandy, and of the men who stormed its beaches remained clear. Tyranny can be resisted and freedom reclaimed, but only at a price paid in courage, blood, and sacrifice. From the beaches of Normandy to the streets of Paris, from the frozen forests of Ardennes to the ruins of Berlin, the march of liberation had been unstoppable. The tide of history had turned, carried by the courage of ordinary men thrust into extraordinary times, and in that turning, the world was changed forever.